There's a model of patronage where instead of buying a ton of art and then building a museum with your name on it, you actually fund great projects, which are very visible, which hundreds of thousands of people interact with. That's where you get your clout and your status, but you don't necessarily own something.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. In 2025, the outlook for the art industry was pretty bleak at the top of the year, and people's worst fears were, in some cases, more than realized. By now, if you're paying any attention to the movements in the art market, you've been hearing the drumbeat of bad news. Galleries shuttering, a lot of buying energy drying up, fairs closing down some operations, and the secondary market going down. But the picture is, as usual, nuanced depending on how you cut it, and there were some upsides to the slowdown, especially with regards to the speculation game of art, which by and large seems to be over, which some people say also isn't the worst thing. There were also the closing months of 2025, which included a successful fall New York auction week and a stronger than expected edition of Art Basel Miami Beach. Following 2 years of a down market, two leading auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, reported at the close of 2025 upticks in total projected revenue. So, is the wind back in the sails after years of a downturn? Has the art market changed in permanent ways? And what shifts can we expect in 2026? I'm very pleased to be joined by Marc Spiegler to consider these questions. For those who don't already know, Marc led Art Basel from 2007 to 2022, and the brand saw a major expansion under his tenureship. He now works on a portfolio of cultural strategy projects, working with major foundations, private corporations, and projects in the immersive, digital, and experiential spaces. Spiegler has long been a visiting professor in cultural management at Bocconi University in Milan, and in 2025 launched the Art Market Minds Academy. With that, I'd like to say hello, Marc, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Kate. It's always a pleasure to see you, whether it's on the Zoom or in person.
For sure. You're back in Zurich after a jet-setting fall, I presume?
Yeah, I think the joke about my travel schedule is it didn't change after I left Art Basel. It just got weirder and more spontaneous.
Yes, weird is one of the topics that we'll be getting into today. The art business is getting weird. You and I have been chatting ahead of this, and we can both agree that it's a hard market to read right now. So we have some big questions, 5 big questions actually, that we're going to pose and spar about a bit. But first, I'd like a quick synopsis from you about why you think that the market is so hard to read right now.
Part of it has to do with the fact that, inherently the art market has been hard to read always. The fact that both of the major auction houses are now privately held doesn't make it any easier, because it used to be that Sotheby's at least had to publish exhaustive results.
Right.
And even at the auction houses, a lot of the sales, a lot of the volume now is private treaty sales. So you don't even see what's going on in a room. And already what you were seeing going on in the room often had a lot of things like chandelier bidding and, people bidding up things that they actually had a commercial interest in. Then, of course, you have the entire gallery world, which is, let's say, half of the market. And there, people only tell you what they want to tell you.
Yeah. Yes, it's a big problem for us as journalists to try to navigate, especially in the first days of an art fair. So I think that's really accurate. And at the same time, there's been this speculation on where the new business is going to be, because there has been this sort of panic about the downturn. And while things are looking better right now, it's not clear how sustainable this is going to be. One of the big gambits for 2026, which will be our sort of first topic, is the Middle East. And I guess the question is the art world betting too deep on the Middle East?
I think that is the $64 billion question, $64 billion being the size of the art world in a good year. On the one hand, obviously, there's a lot of activity going on in the Middle East. We have a kind of soft power race between Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Saudi Arabia. And each of them, interestingly, have been approaching this in different ways. The Saudis have leaned more into doing their own branded events, but using Western expertise and Western figures. Abu Dhabi has partnered with people from outside to bring their own brands, like the Guggenheim and Louvre and Team Lab, and of course, most recently, Frieze. Qatar traditionally built its own things using great architects like I.M. Pei and Jean Nouvel, but of course, Art Basel Qatar is launching in February. And then, of course, Dubai has been more of a commercial marketplace because it was the freest and most dynamic part of the region. Interestingly, they just announced the Tadao Ando Museum. So what's interesting is the way in which the soft power games are being played, and they are being played with very, very big budgets, and that's clear. but also the way in which people's strategies, which used to be more distinct from each other, are becoming a little bit more conflated. All of that being said, I had a conversation with a gallerist who's very active in the region, who's from the region. And I said exactly this. I said, hey, Art Basel Qatar, February, Frieze Abu Dhabi in November, what do you think? Like, is the buying power there? And the important thing is, clearly the governmental buying power is there. What's not clear is the private buying power. And if you look at the data that Claire McAndrew has regularly produced for the UBS and Art Basel Art Market Report, something like 85% of the buying in the art market is private. It's a mix of private collectors, private museums, people working with art advisors. So in the art market as we know it, governmental entities have played a very small role. And so if the Middle East is going to save the market, it's going to be in a very different way because, as my gallerist friend said, his estimation was there may be somewhere between a dozen and 24 active private collectors in the region. Parenthetically, what is a serious collector in this context? The best definition I've heard is it's when your storage bill is bigger than your mortgage, but it doesn't really matter. We can use different metrics, but the reality is there are not as many active private collectors in the entire Middle East as you would have in the tri-state area, or perhaps even a city like London or Paris.
Right. And, that dovetails with something that art advisor Ed Dolman was saying to art market columnist Tim Schneider in a recent piece for the Art newspaper. By and large, 60% of the market is being purchased and sold by less than 250 clients. So it begs this question, like, how much demand is there for another art fair? I mean, the first year, I think a lot of people are going to descend on Art Basel Qatar and also Frieze Abu Dhabi. But are they going to be the ones who are going to continue to have to buy in the Middle East? I guess this is the question, right? Like, are they going to be able to bring up a new generation of buyers? And Dolman also told Kelly Crow at Wall Street Journal that there is a new generation of young buyers in the region. Of course, there's also Qatar is well located. It's equidistant in a sense from New York as it is to Shanghai. And there's also India and the whole South Pacific that can get there very easily. But it remains to be seen. I mean, 250 is still a small number, right?
Yeah, and I think he's talking about that globally. And what's interesting is I did a piece for Business of Fashion for my Arts Radar column a while back, and I was talking to Louis Guzer, and he was saying that what was interesting to him about the market is the fact that there are new players, and they're coming in at the highest level. And this explains also why you got these unexpectedly good results during the auctions. I'm sure those people are within the 250 that Dolman was talking about. But when we're talking about a market that has to sustain hundreds of galleries working with thousands of artists, it's going to take more than a few people. And the other thing is, the people coming in at that level tend to be looking for trophies and not for emerging young artists. Like, I don't think they're going to do the thing that you and I do, Kate, which is like go to London and like go out to the East End and hop on a Lime bike and, walk down weird alleys to see strange galleries with cool young artists. I think these people are the type that are going to like walk around Mayfair, walk up and down Madison Avenue, like that's their shopping trip. And that's cool. But if you think of the art market as an environment whose purpose is to sustain cultural production. In the same way that if you think of companies whose purpose is not to generate shareholder value, but to generate employment. If you think of the art market not as a place where speculators trade in baubles and billionaires adorn their houses, but whose purpose is to drive patronage to the artists that you and I and probably everybody listening to this podcast listen to, then it's not going to be enough to have a dozen whales coming into the market every year.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I was actually looking at the list of Art Basel Qatar because a young dealer pointed out to me that there are no emerging galleries going to the fair. It's an approach, I don't think that their strategy for this fair is to even bring in, the young emerging faces that we're used to seeing at the other fairs, which, gets to something that we're going to talk about later, which is regionalization. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And it also connects to something that we've been seeing at Art Basel and at Frieze, which is that this so-called graduation program that you would be able to move from the young gallery sector very smoothly to the main sector. That is just not the pattern anymore. We need to evolve this model because that myth just has been busted. This is not how it works.
Okay, so I'm going to do a rare thing, Kate, which is to disagree with you, or at least start to disagree with you. In this sense, like, I think actually the path is clearer to move up into the main sectors in Frieze and in Basel. Certainly at Art Basel and Art Basel Paris, it's very hard to get into the main sectors because those fairs are still so competitive. Every other fair, because of people closing or quitting the fairs, has more space. And what's interesting to me is the fact that a lot of younger galleries are choosing not to enter the main sector. They are choosing not to take the greater risk because they don't necessarily buy into the notion that they have to make this progression. I think actually the issue is not that the young galleries can't graduate. Like if I think about when I was running Art Basel, all the galleries that were knocking at the door ready to come in, like they're now in the main sector. And that's because, of course, there was a generational shift. I think the big issue is that there's not a next generation of galleries coming up as hard as we had, say, 10 years ago, but also that a lot of the galleries coming up are looking at the people that were the front runners of the previous generation who closed. They look at people like Clearing and JTT and they say, like, that's not the path. I don't necessarily want to do 10 fairs in my fourth year of business.
That's an interesting point for sure. To sort of phase us into the next big question, which we've already kind of touched on, which is, will the art world go regional in 2026? Will this regionalization movement continue to move? I think there is like a connecting point with the Middle East. I was talking to a journalist at ArtNet, Vivian Chow, and she was saying that there are some comparisons to be drawn perhaps between the rush to South Korea and the rush to the Middle East, and there's a regional lesson here where a lot of Western galleries, Vivian was saying, that bet on Korea. They are now, seeing that what Korean buyers want is to buy Korean art. They're not bringing their Western positions to this fair as much. So in general, I think that perhaps brings us to this question, like, has there been this anti-globalization turn and will it continue to be that way? And will fairs really have to define themselves by their regional profiles as opposed to this global carousel of traveling patrons?
So I think the Korea example is interesting. I would say probably part of the reason why gallerists are having difficulty selling foreign artists in Korea might be the fact that the won has dropped strongly against other currencies. And so suddenly foreign artists are 10 or 15% more expensive than they were before. Maybe that's too granular. So I think you have two competing factors here, which will determine the degree to which maybe not the art world, but individual members of the art world live more or less regional existences moving forward. One is the fact that every card-carrying member of the art world that I respect, that I find interesting, is a neophiliac. It's a word that, to the best of my knowledge, Charles Saatchi invented or at least introduced in the art world. He said we're all neophiliacs, and I agree. The interesting people in the art world, and most of them are interesting, are people who will go really far to see a cool young gallery or to check out a new fair. I think a lot of people are trekking to Thailand. I just couldn't make it this fall, but I'm going to make it next year. When you sense something bubbling up, you want to see it for yourself. Like when you see K-culture, and not just like Korean art, but I mean more globally, K-pop, K-movie, K-skincare, et cetera. You want to see that. You want to understand, like, what the hell is this gentle monster thing? What's going on in Korea with all these museums? And you see it. You want to see it. Of course, after a certain point, you've seen it, right? And like either you fall in love with that place. I happen to love Korea because I feel like when I'm there, I'm in the future. But maybe you don't fall in love with it. And you're like, well, that was a fun fling, and now we're going to move on. And of course, there are new places coming along, right? The other thing that I think is going to be interesting is we live in an art fair duopoly world, basically. The top 10 fairs in the world unquestionably are owned by either Art Basel or by Frieze as an organization. And next year, those two organizations will stage a total of 13 fairs. The two of them together will bring at least 2 fairs to every continent except Latin America and Antarctica. And Australia, if that's a continent. I can never keep track. But so the question is, I don't think anyone is going to do all 13 fairs unless they work for a major gallery and they're like on the fair team, right? And so what's interesting to me is what happens when you have not just the tyranny of choice, but almost like the oppression of choice. I first started thinking about this during the evolution of Art Basel Miami Beach, which I tracked as a journalist. So in the first year, if I remember correctly, you had just Art Basel. The second year, you had Art Basel and Scope and Design Miami and maybe Nada. And then you had like 4 fairs. And everybody, who wasn't too lazy or partying too hard went to all 4 fairs because that's what you did, But then suddenly there were like 8 fairs and 12 fairs and 22 fairs. And what was interesting is the people who used to go to 4 fairs were like, well, actually, I definitely don't need to go to Scope. And I'll make it to Nada if I can. Maybe I'll swing by Design Miami. And so what's interesting to me is my observation is that when you give people too many options, even the completists retreat. It's not they do as much as they did before. They do less because they now make a conscious choice. It's not like I will do everything. It's like, well, what can I actually do? What do I want to do? And so the question, I think, will be, what does the art world want to do? I mean, keep in mind that in addition to those 13 fairs, you also have the Venice Biennial. So that's like 14 art world events in 12 months. And people get tired and people don't do business in every place. And if people aren't careful, they start seeing the same stuff over and over. So this combination of like déjà vu and making choices and trying to live some semblance of a balanced life. And, many of us have kids and many of us have partners we want to spend time with. And many of us don't actually make money going to these things. Like we need to go back, like we consume somewhere and then we have to come back and digest and produce. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, and now quite directly, I observe a greater regionalization in the art world. We saw Paris was really international because people were super excited about it. It's the second year of the Grand Palais. Paris is super chic. It's a tight fair. They're good museum shows. So there you saw a large cross-section of the art world, which you didn't see as much of at Frieze, and you didn't see as much of in Miami, and you certainly didn't see in Seoul. I wasn't there, but I don't think you saw it at the Armory either. And then the question is, how do you make an event work if you're not able to draw the international art crowd because they've made other choices, right? And what's interesting to me is this is kind of an echo of a previous pattern I'd observed in the art world already starting 10 years ago. When I entered the art world, when I started going to major art world events, like I would go to Documenta and everybody was there. Artists, gallerists, critics, auction house people, advisors. There was this kind of notion that like, if you were going to be in the art world, you needed to see Documenta yourself. Now, I think the curators feel like they need to see it. I don't think the auction house advisors feel like they need to see it. I don't think that the consultants feel like they need to see it. I'm not even sure that all journalists feel like they need to see it. And so what's interesting is you have this kind of fractionalization of the art world into like its different stakeholder groups into different camps, and they have their own events, but they don't interact as much as they did, which I think is super sad. I think it's interesting to talk to people who do something different than you in the art world. And so I love this art world, this kind of traveling circus, but the reality is the circus has gotten so busy and there are so many stops that nobody can do them all.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of really interesting points there. And I think the question of regionalization is also right-sizing things for the audiences in light of what you said, where people just can't be traveling all the time. People work for their money. Even super wealthy people, a lot of them are working for their money. And yeah, it's something we've talked about on the podcast before, this bifurcation, or as you say, actually could be a fractionalization into many different parts of the art world. And in particular, there is less of a pressure. And it's also, this is a social networked place and a social networked business. You don't need to check the box of being at all 5 art Basels in order to be deemed a successful gallery anymore. It's okay to drop out. I mean, at Art Basel Miami Beach in 2025, a few galleries dropped out, and it's not like anyone thinks that the writing is on the wall. It's like an acceptable thing to be doing at this point. And I feel like that would have been quite shocking a few years ago. And yeah, your point about Paris is really interesting. I think that a lot of wealthy people are concentrating there at the moment. But I do think in the long term that Paris's strength is going to be Paris itself and the Paris galleries and the Paris buyers. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the galleries that rush to open satellites there are going to quietly be scaling back business. And to that effect, in London in 2025, there was also a lean in on the regional. A lot of London dealers were talking about focusing on London. A lot of the London galleries were showing local artists. So yeah, it is a change. I think, it gets us to the next question, which is how do galleries respond to all of this? There's a lot of changing pressures, and it is going to reshape the way everything looks for the primary market in particular. And the question for us is really like how, maybe if, but how will the emerging and middle market recover from these couple of years, which saw so much change?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's the old model is probably broken. What is the new model for galleries at that smaller and mid-level? The good thing, not for society, but for art gallerists, is that there is an ever greater number of very wealthy people. The bad thing is that galleries have been very, very bad at recruiting them into buying art. We saw during a period in which the number of billionaires surged and during which companies that deal in luxury goods went through the roof, that the art market stagnated. And in fact, if you look at the UBS and Art Basel art market report and you look at the chart, we all know where the market goes up and down. If you inflation adjust that chart, it actually shows you not a market which is going up and down, but a market which is actually declining. The highs are lower and the valleys are lower. And the overall impact is that the market is declining in a way which isn't just the last 2 years, it's the last 15 years. It's kind of mind-boggling that at a time when you have more potential clients, you don't, as an industry, grow. In a market which was driven forward, at least in the short term, and we'll get to this, by financialization, the number of regions in which it was present increased, and the number of events increased, that the market still didn't grow. And so I think there's a fundamental problem with how art is being positioned and how galleries are recruiting collectors. And I think the future galleries which work, when I look at galleries who I think are meeting the moment, I think of someone like Vanessa Carlos, so Carlos Yoshikawa in the East End. Vanessa, as a person and as a gallery, has a very distinct identity. Her artists are like a family. She stays very close to them, both geographically and emotionally. She has a core of collectors who are very loyal to her. And it's not about ever bigger galleries. I mean, she's in the same place where she's always been. Like, I've been going to that East End, like past the mechanic shop and the halal food stand, it feels like for the last 15 years. And it's not because she didn't have artists that would have sustained her growing into a bigger space. So I think the future gallery model is not empire building. I think it's community building. And I think the reality is this. Major galleries have always been sustained by a handful of collectors. If you looked at the revenue for a mega gallery, you would probably find that it's not even like 20/80 rule. It's like more like probably like 5/90 rule. Like 5% of the collectors represent 90% of the revenues, And so the reality is that you don't need to have 200 collectors to function as a gallery. You need to have 15 that really work with you. And by the way, operating at a completely different scale, it's also how I think of a gallery like Sadie Cole's, a relatively tight group of artists, of collectors working together to do great things with each other. So I think the sort of expansionist, let's call it alpha male model of gallery development is something that needs to be reconsidered because it certainly hasn't proved out very well.
Mm-hmm.
It may work for the half dozen mega galleries, but that model doesn't work farther down the chain. They have to play a different game.
This, gets into this buzzword of 2025, the K-shaped economy. And I think, in 2025, in the auction weeks, there was all this excitement about the sale of the Gustav Klimt painting, which set a record. There was like a Triceratops that also set a record. And these records and the secondary market trading does not have a clear effect on the primary market, on contemporary artists, on ultra-contemporary artists who tend to be younger and more emerging. The whole thing is very loosely correlated. So I think that your point about galleries like Vanessa Carlos, and it makes me think of Jenny-Ann Frederick, who also is experiencing a lot of success right now. And every time I ask him, he's like, I'm staying in this spot. I've got a staff of, I think 1.5 or 2.5 people or something like that. And I think that's a choice and a strategy, but it's a strategy and underneath which is that these big numbers that are happening at the top of the chain are not having a trickle down anymore. These billionaires that are buying these things are not buying emerging art. And then also at the same time, the millionaires, and there's more of them than ever before, they don't seem to be buying this under 15K price tag work with quite the same cadence. So it's a strange, confluence of issues. And, I was sad to see that Pristina's Lambda Lambda Lambda, which was such a cool gallery, closed in 2025. I do think that the road is going to be really rocky ahead for the emerging market still.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Kate, the fact that we're talking about a Triceratops... that has nothing to do with anything. That's not art. Or the fact that Maurizio Catalan's golden toilet, which was famously stolen from Blenheim Castle, did not sell to an art collector. It didn't sell to Dr. Schwanu. It didn't even sell to Justin Sun, the Bitcoin bro who bought the banana and then ate it famously. It's sold to Ripley's Believe It or Not. Like, this is not sustainable. I don't think Ripley's Believe It or Not is going to become a major buyer at Sotheby's and Christie's. I think what's interesting is that the people coming into the game are not necessarily the ones who are scouring younger galleries looking for younger artists, you know? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But again, there is a lot of wealth out there. There are a lot of people spending a lot of money on things. But increasingly, those things are not things, they're experiences. If you look at the luxury world, the growth area is not fashion, meaning clothing. It's beauty and wellness. If you look at where money is getting spent more and more on things like bringing all your friends to Burning Man on a private jet, or ayahuasca retreats, or it's, going on luxury wellness retreats to Southeast Asia. The hard part for galleries who are trying to build the communities I was speaking about before is going to be convincing the people who have money to buy art, and to buy art at scale. I had a very interesting conversation with two Zurich collectors. We were all on the same train going to Art Basel Paris. And I had just written an article about this generational wealth shift. And they're a little bit older than me, these two female collectors. And they were talking about this. And I was saying, do your daughters collect? And they both have daughters in the art world. And they said, yes. And I said, do they collect as much as you? And they said, no. And I said, will they? And they said, probably not. I said, last question. Do either of these women own a car? And the answer was no. And I think what we're talking about is a lot of money. That's not the question, but it's a lot of money in the hands of people that don't necessarily want to own a lot of art, certainly are less likely to own so much art that they need to start racking up storage bills, and almost even more certainly will not buy so much art that they need to build a private museum. The one caveat to all this, as I would say, is I have met a handful of Asian-based younger collectors, like early 30s to early 40s, and they have this enthusiasm. They want to own art. They want to build museums. So I would say, and I talk a lot about generational wealth shift, probably more than anybody else. This is one of my hobby horses because I'm the child of two social scientists. So this kind of stuff interests me, but this demographic, psychographic shift. But I will say this, that I think it might be truer of the West and of the East. That being said, I don't think that 20 enthusiastic young Asian collectors buying art and filling museums and building museums is going to compensate for the shift that we're seeing right now in the West.
I agree with you. And I think that we'll continue to see in 2026 more collaboration within the art market, within industry players. I mean, in 2025, there was New Perspective Art Partners that Dolman put together with some regional experts, and then Pasty, Donna, and Schrader making a collaborative entity to work in the secondary market. And then on the side of the primary market galleries, Hannah Hoffman and Bridget Donahue merging their galleries together. So I think that to this end, collaboration is going to be a key word going forward as everything sort of remodels itself. And this, as you mentioned, like taste just continues to be a little bit murky for people. And that brings me to our fourth question, which is, will digital art ever actually be a thing? So, at Art Basel Miami Beach in 2025, there was the 010 sector, which was, buzzing in the headlines. But then at the same time, Christie's quietly closed their digital art department earlier in the fall of 2025. So I feel like this is a real tricky question in 2026.
This is indeed a tricky question. And it's also an area on which I have to upfront say it's not one that I'm an expert on. Although I am someone who's been following digital art for a long time, I have a lot of friends in the space. I'm friendly with people who also were involved in the project at Art Basel Miami Beach. And I do have to say, digital art is not just NFTs. NFTs were a bubble, and it was a bubble that collapsed so spectacularly that people in that space don't even use the word NFT. The word NFT has been canceled. It's now like digital objects on chain or digital art on chain or whatever it is. I don't think the market for digital art, to the extent that it does develop, will develop in the same way that the art market has. I think we have to think about new models. Maybe it's just my age or the fact that my mother was an artist, but I just don't get excited about an art collection that you can store on your phone. That's not cool to me. I'm super fascinated about the kind of conceptual things, artworks that disappear unless they're traded. Damien Hirst did this thing where he had sold an NFT that went with an edition, and after a year, you had to decide whether you were going to destroy the edition or destroy the NFT. These kind of conceptual games are very cool. It's strange to say that actually what's most interesting about digital art is not the images, which frankly are often quite bro-ish, but rather the conceptual games you can play with them. A pretty long ex-post that Benny Gross, aka Redbeard, put online. And he was one of the people who's been heavily involved with Art Basel's thinking around digital art. He was basically saying to the digital art community, if we want this to be taken seriously, we need to be better patrons. We need to buy art without thinking about selling it. We need to support the projects that are important. And it's interesting because it's actually the same kind of Jeremiad, if I pronounce that correctly, that you have other collectors making. You have like older collectors saying, guys, let's be serious. So we need to support museums. We can't be here to flip things. We need to pay the galleries on time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think digital art is succeeding. Look at the work that someone like John Raffman or Jacoby Satterwhite is making. Like, what's interesting to me is like when I look at AI in the art world, which by the way is the topic of the next Art Market Minds Academy. When I look at this, what's interesting to me is AI is something that artists are having a lot of fun with and playing with. The mainstream market hasn't figured out what the hell to do with it. But I think digital, AI, digital production techniques, all of these things are things that artists are using. Sometimes it's people like Trevor Paglen, for example, who's using digital techniques to make art about the problems with digital culture, the problems with technology driving surveillance capitalism. Sometimes it's people using art to imagine new universes or new scripts, like Lawrence Leck is one good example. There are infinite possibilities with digital art. And I think it's to the extent that people who are operating within the traditional market are using digital art. I think Hito Stierl is making amazing things digitally, and there's endless other artists doing that. It's really interesting to watch. So I think digital art is already here. The question is, will the traditional art market, will the legacy art market be able to capture and convert the people who were driving the NFT market, which was an entirely different set of people? Can you get those people to be as excited about buying a Hito Stierl video and maybe donating it to a museum, or about supporting the efforts of artists who are working in the digital space? Can you get them as excited as they were about buying NFTs? And the answer is probably not all of them, but already if you got 10% into that converting over, that would be great. And by the way, that's why Christie's closed its department, because they weren't able to get the people who were buying NFTs to convert over into buying the higher ticket physical objects.
Right. And then vice versa. It seems like it's been harder to get the traditional collectors to move into the NFT space. I sort of wonder if the delineation is helpful as a marketing strategy. Digital art is about as specific as saying painting or photography, and I'm not sure that this is going to continue to be an effective way to look at things. You mentioned so many fantastic artists who are often showing in the main sectors. I understand the pitch of 010 to get people onto the fair floor, and honestly, probably with hopes that there's going to be some cross-pollination from the two sides. But the eventuality of that, if this is successful, is that there doesn't need to be a digital art sector of a fair, that these things can coexist. At this point, we are all relatively fluent in ChatGPT and using these tools, and most people understand the basic premises of blockchain. We don't necessarily need to continue to be educating people, but with a little platform anymore. That's sort of my feeling. And, you brought up a point about new patrons again in this, and they do have different desires and they want to do things differently. That's something we've spoken about before, is that patrons are going to need to understand that supporting the arts is not just whether you're buying an NFT or whether you're buying a painting. It's not just transacting over an artwork. It's about finding ways to support artist practices differently, right? Funding has been cut all over Europe for the most part, and definitely in the States in 2025. At the same time, artists are living in cities that are by and large very expensive to live in. So I think that patronage is going to look different, and it's not just about the kind of categories of art.
So it's interesting. I had a conversation with Doug Aitken, and Doug and I have been friends for a long time. And what was really interesting is we were talking about the art market and how it's evolving and the new models. And he was saying that he feels like almost every piece that he does now has a different kind of model around it, that he needs to build a different structure. And I think what's really important here, Kate, is we can't kind of wag our fingers at people and say, if you want to be a patron, you have to do this. life has taught me you have to meet people where they are, especially if those people have the money that you want to fund your project. So I think successful artists and successful galleries will become very good at understanding what is it that's going to attract someone to buy a work, to support a work. And I think there is a new model of patronage, and Doug and I have talked about this a lot. There's a model of patronage where instead of buying a ton of art and then building a museum with your name on it, you actually fund great projects, which are very visible, which hundreds of thousands of people interact with. That's where you get your clout and your status, but you don't necessarily own something. It's about offering something to the public, and then maybe you give your friends special access, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, if we want the new wealthy to be patrons, if we want the next generation to be patrons, we, meaning the art world, artists, people who think about this, have to meet them where they are and have to give them what they want, or even better, we have to give them things they didn't know they wanted.
Yeah. And this connects with the last big question. I'd actually like to use your term. Can the art world become magical again? Can it get weird? In 2025, we saw the sort of definancialization of the art industry really accelerate, and the music stopped in a lot of ways, but there's short-term pains of that. And I don't want to just graze over those, but there's an upside, right?
Yeah, if people learn the lesson, to go back to where that terminology comes from, Kate, I wrote an article a while back saying we need to stop hyping art as an investment, because I think that's been super dangerous. For one thing, it's not a great investment. Unless you're an insider, you tend to lose money, or certainly not to make as much money as you could have doing something else. The other thing is that I think positioning art as an investment has actually scared away a lot of potentially great collectors. They thought they were getting into a discussion about culture, and suddenly they found themselves at a dinner table with people talking about the 2 or 3x gains they were getting on something they'd bought at Nada, So I think art has to be positioned as magic. And I think the less it's positioned as magic, the less chances we have of it thriving. I think we really have to return to the notion that artists are people who create magical objects. Artists are people who create magical experiences, that having those experiences, having those objects in your life is transformative and is a better use of your money than anything else. And I think that narrative is super important. And I think we have to keep in mind that what keeps us alive as individuals and as species is the narratives that we build around things. And the narrative you can build around culture, and I use culture in the broadest sense, it's also music and film and theater and performance. And all these things, by the way, are bleeding into the art world now in a really cool transversal, to use a French term, kind of way,
For sure.
So I actually think what the art world needs is to be open to new models, to tear down the walls between itself and other creative industries, to be less gatekeeping, less velvet roping, to be more open, to meet people where they are and not expect people to act like their parents. Because the reality is this, as much as it was a really tough year for the art world, as much as we see a lot of pain and suffering and closures, art is super well positioned to thrive now, because it's visual, and we live in the era of visual social media. And we also live in the era of personified brands, and every artist can be a personified brand. And maybe the gallery model is not the only model. Maybe the gallery model works for some artists and not for others. And new models need to emerge, whether that's people doing more multiples, or people working with agents to do non-material projects, or people working across creative industries. All these things are possible. But the thing is that you have to remember, Darwin's survival of the fittest was not only the strong survive. It's the most adaptable survive. And so I think we live in a moment where we have to learn from the crisis, give up old ways, and adapt into new realities.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think, within there's a call to action for artists too, that they need to adapt. And there's an invitation that you're basically making, which is go back to being weird, making risky art. I think that the last decade trained up a generation of artists to think that they would be able to find a trick and then continue to do it. This is really broad stroked what I'm saying right now, but that did work for a lot of artists, especially in the speculative bubble, and it's not working anymore. And I think My friend, the art critic Christian Vistrup Madsen, wrote a great essay in 2024, I think it was, arguing for mood over content and saying, that artwork is allowed to get artistic again. It's allowed to get atmospheric. Let's see it as a relational force. It doesn't need to be pitched. It doesn't need to have spectacle. And so there's a call to action from collectors that we've hit on today, the galleries remodeling, but also for artists to change the way that they expect things to go for themselves, right?
I mean, Kate, it sounds like you're kind of expanding on the Hunter Thompson phrase, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro, and I think if we want people to be excited about the art world, it has to be special. Mm-hmm. We need to throw the best parties. We need to deliver the best experiences. We need to tell the most interesting stories. We need to be the canaries in the mine shaft that actually project the future first, right? Churning out objects is not it. I had a great experience recently. I was in New York and I was coming out of the first gallery I went to see, which happened to be 303. And I was walking up towards Paula Cooper and a car pulled up and I saw Tiona Nakia McLeodin, who's a great artist who I'm friendly with. And completely spontaneously, we spent the next 3 hours seeing art. It was interesting because we talked a lot about where the art world is and her choice to live in Philadelphia rather than New York and the various projects she's working on, including some really major stuff, which I can't discuss. But artists are really special people. And I think sometimes the art world forgets that and they treat them like they're the creative directors of a brand. But people need to dig into the weirdness and coolness of artists. And artists are not influencers. Artists are people who do real shit and who have deep thoughts and who have things to tell us, and they can be standing right in front of us, or you can be looking at a Cornell box or a Caravaggio painting, or these amazing Ruth Asawa sculptures. And the point is, I think we need to get closer to the artists again. And I think that that's what's going to make people excited about art. Not just the objects they produce, but also the people behind them and the extent to which those objects and those experiences and interactions with those artists led us into these very special universes.
I absolutely agree, and I think to that end, a slowed down economy, a decompressed art fair calendar where attention is not so highly competitive will work in favor of that. So there are some long-term gains to be made from the short-term pains that I think that we've touched on today. Just want to thank you, Marc, for joining me. We covered a lot of ground. We'll see how the year goes and how right or wrong we were.
Kate, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and Happy New Year to everybody out there listening to the podcast.
Yeah, Happy New Year, and Happy New Year to you too, Marc. That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It'll help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from myself, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.